What is the connection between somebody having a bad relationship with their dad and becoming an atheist?
What I found with atheists, and I looked at intense atheists, people who were really sort of preoccupied with it and were important in the history of the Western intellectual thought. And when I looked at them, I found that a large number of them had very dysfunctional fathers. But of course, to be able to show this, I had to compare them to well-known believers at the same time. So we had a control group which were good believers. They believed in, they either Christians or occasionally Jews who had a deep faith in God and living at the same time as the atheists who were being really aggressive about their atheism. And then I looked at their childhood, and the evidence of their childhood was very, very clear. Over and over, I found dysfunctional fathers in the lives of the intense atheists and good fathers in the lives of the theists and believers.
Could you give an example of some prominent ones, maybe some that we might be familiar with today?
Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, famous atheist who's God, and a biography of Nietzsche was written by an unbeliever who said Nietzsche's life was in search of the Father. And he ended up with an answer. The answer was the Superman. Not God, but the Superman. But his father was a minister, Protestant minister, and he died when Nietzsche was 4 years old. And he was deeply attached, and it was a big loss for him, and he became an atheist because he had this dysfunctional father. That is, the representation of God is in your own father when you're young, particularly. Your father stands for God as the basic psychological model. And so if that model isn't present or is dysfunctional and abusive or dead or whatever, it makes you think, it sets you up to become an atheist. The new atheists that have bad fathers, you may know some of these: Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, and Christopher Hitchens.
Mm-hmm.
Christopher Hitchens is now deceased, but the others are alive and still. But let's look at the good fathers. These were the intellectuals that were at the same time as those I mentioned. Blaise Pascal was a Catholic, very serious. George Berkeley, Protestant Englishman. Joseph Butler, Thomas Reed, Edmund Burke. Moses Mendelssohn, he was Jewish, but he had a good father. And he even said that, mentioning that he was his father's son is in some way important for his own faith. William Wilberforce, famous Protestant believer. Who else do we have here? John Henry Newman was a Catholic, but a very strong, good father. Who else? Samuel Wilberforce. Well, his father was William Wilberforce, and he became a bishop, Samuel, his son, in the Church of England. G.K. Chesterton, Albert Schweitzer, Martin Buber, Karl Barth, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and Abraham Heschel. Those are a mixture of Christians, that is Protestants and Catholics and Jews, all of whom had good fathers at the time that these other men were going into atheism.
So one of the things you talk about in the book, which I thought was really important, an important distinction, is that fatherlessness is not necessarily the cause of unbelief or the cause of rejecting Jesus or rejecting a personal God.
It's a predisposing factor.
Yeah.
Other things can affect it and change it.
Mm-hmm. And ultimately, we know that at the heart of unbelief, the scriptures tell us the heart of rejection of God is sin. But I think your book highlights that the fatherlessness predisposes people to atheism, and in particular types of atheism, like an intense atheism, where you've got like the Richard Dawkins and the New Atheists, for example, where their career is based on promoting a rejection of God. It's not just a personal rejection of God that
they want everybody else to do the same.
Exactly. A kind of and interesting with Dawkins. I'd like for you to maybe unpack a little bit about Dawkins' journey, because you highlighted that his atheism began before his scientific journey.
Yes, that's very important, because he implies it comes from science. But he was rejecting God and going to chapel. He was doing that, before he'd ever gotten into science yet. He was still a boy, an early adolescent at a private school in England. And it looks like he got abused by Anglican clergy man. And that would be a good enough reason to want not to go to chapel if the guy was there. But that would have set up the hostility with having a bad father figure in your life early on, before you were a scientist.
Yeah, and I can see that, and I can also see why he's very big on spreading the idea that religions are evil and looking at them from a moral perspective, whilst at the same time saying that there is no absolute morality, and it's almost kind of contradiction.
How can you say there's evil if there's no absolute morality?
Yeah, exactly. And so
evil is an absolute bad. Yeah.
And that would make total sense. That actually so I suppose a representation of a father, you think of a chaplain or an older, well-respected man associated with the church, rather than being a good influence, actually being an abusive influence, projecting that onto God or the idea of a personal deity. So how would you answer people who would say, well, okay, correlation does not prove causation? How would you answer that?
Well, I would say if you get all of these correlations across a lot of different places, it's beginning to imply causation. But then you can start looking at causation in a different way. You can say, what could be psychologically behind it? And I've already mentioned one way, in which is that God, your own father, is the first model, the first understanding of what God is like. So it would serve as a way of being hostile to God once you know you're hostile to your father. Another thing is this. We now know that the early attachments of children to their mother and father are extremely important. These attachment problems, in other words, this is the major psychological theory today about adult mental pathology. It is that it comes from failure of attachment with the mother or the father or both. That is, without getting a loving commitment from either, you're in real trouble. Not even getting loving attachment from your father is going to put you in real trouble of a different kind. If you get no loving attachment from your mother, you're not going to be able to cause much trouble in the life of others. You won't be functioning very well at all. Without the emotional attachment that your mother gives you, you'll probably be too depressed to become an active political atheist or anything like that. You'll be just sitting there depressed or withdrawn or incompetent or whatever.
That's really interesting, Dr. Paul, as well, because you talked about with Christopher Hitchens. If we look at him, for example, you talked about how he had. So I'd like for you actually to explain a bit about the fathers and the father substitutes in his life, because you talked about how one of the things that caused the damage in that relationship was seeing the father substitute as the cause of his mother's death. And so that mother, who he obviously was close with, that there was a kind of complex relationship there. Could you talk a bit more about that?
You mean about that? That was Christopher Hitchens, right? Well, he already had a rather distant father, but he was attached quite a good deal to his mother. They had a lot in common and kept in touch. So when Hitchens goes to Oxford, he suddenly gets a call from his mother saying that she's going to get divorced from the father. Well, they go out to meet, and they discover, and Hitchens, young Hitchens, discovers that his mother is infatuated with a kind of guru man who's an ex-Anglican reverend. And he keeps calling him in his biography the ex-rev. And the ex-rev is now has now become an implicit substitute father, because he's now the father of his mother, the husband of his mother, and therefore implicitly so to speak, a substitute father. But they're not married, but they're going together. So they travel off together, his mother and this ex-rev. They travel off to go to India to start getting in contact with some of the gurus there. Now, this was in the 1960s. Some of you may remember what the Beatles were doing there at the same time, getting involved. But anyway, so the ex-rev and his mother, they fly off to India, but they stop. The plane stops in Greece, I think in Athens. And then he gets word back from out of the blue from a friend who says, "Is this your mother who's been found murdered?" And sure enough, his mother had been murdered or killed. Yeah, killed in Greece.
How old was Christopher Hitchens at this time?
At this time, he was I'd say about 21 or 22.
Okay.
Had already felt distant from his normal father. And then this ex-rev, the new father, who's still called sometimes fathers, I forget his first name, because of his linkage to his past being an Anglican priest. And so when it's all settled down, he flies out there to see his mother's body and find out what happened. And it turns out it seems to have been a suicide pact in which the ex-rev killed his mother and then shot himself.
Wow.
Well, this sort of puts the icing on the cake of his distant father. And so it was very interesting. One of the other things about Hitchens was that he was very much opposed to abortion. And his mother had an abortion, but he interpreted this as pressure from his father, the natural father.
That last point, I think, highlights one of the key points that you speak about in the book, which is that many people have this idea that atheism is for the rational, objective grown-ups, and theism is for the irrational, needy children, and that we look for God to satisfy our own emotional needs. But what you just highlighted is the link or the connection between many atheists and not only their atheism, but also some of their other moral positions that stem from or are at least influenced by similar attachment issues or previous traumas in their past and various things like that as well. So I think do you think that's a very overlooked fact about how atheism shaped?
It's been very overlooked. To the best of my knowledge, when I first published on this, those were the first papers to say it. Now I have it out in a book form, of course, but called Faith of the Fatherless. But one of the other things to point out is that what I dealt with in these first chapters of the book were with public atheists. That means they were intense about it. Everybody knew this. This was part of their meaning of their life or whatever, their message. And then I compared them to theists who lived at the same time and in the same cultures, who were well known as believers, and then looked at the childhood of each of the two groups and found these dysfunctional fathers. But there were other kinds of atheists besides intellectual atheists. And three of them that I think are very important were political atheists. And the three political atheists that are important are Hitler, Stalin, and Mao Zedong. And all three of them, they were atheists. They didn't try to make it an intellectual thing. They just assumed it and were somewhat aggressive about it, but they didn't make it an intellectual point. Their primary preoccupation was with politics. But all three of them, Hitler, Stalin, and Mao Zedong, had bad and dysfunctional fathers.
And how do you think their experience shaped them to manifest that more through the political route than some of the other intellectual types?
Well, I think they must have had a more natural desire for power than for intellectual understanding. But the thing to keep in mind is that when you have a dysfunctional father, what you have is, if you're going to be intense about it, and all of these political atheists were intense, even though they weren't about atheism, they were filled with anger and hatred. What it does is fill you with resentment that your father treated you with indifference or hostility or died on you when you needed him and was so weak you had to invent a Superman. So that's the psychology of it. And you have this intense anger. And usually it doesn't show up either in the ability to be a political leader or even in the ability to be an intellectual writer about it. Usually it shows up in people with less significant minds, your average Joe or truck driver or what have you. But our criminal, in the United States, we have a large criminal population in jail. I think we have in the U.S. the largest,
incarceration rate.
population in prison of any country, and I think it's the largest per capita. And I've been told by many people that these buildings, these institutions, which house mostly young men, they're almost all young men, that they were housing men who had no fathers.
Yeah.
And so they take it out. And one of the ways you can try to find a substitute father if you're growing up in many places is to join a gang. Joining a gang, and then of course immediately the gang is living off of doing things that are criminal. But you're 15 or 17, and the leader of the gang is 25. He's your father figure. He's your, he's the person you have to prove yourself to.
Yeah.
And so you do it by following in those steps.
Yeah. And I wonder if there's also something in the difference between the kind of political atheists who manifest atheism through politics, force, as the examples you gave, and then the intellectual types, maybe also a belief, a self-belief about what they can achieve through power. So I knew Nietzsche, for example, was very frail and quite a weak, physically weak man.
Yes.
So maybe there wasn't that belief that he could manifest it in the more powerful or dominant sphere, but intellectually there's a bit more of a level playing field there. I wonder about that.
Yeah. Yes, that's the one place where he did have real competence. If he tried to do it physically, he was not there.
Yeah, exactly. And so a question I would, so as I read the book, I was wondering to myself, why then, if somebody's had a weak, abusive or absent father, why would that not lead them to seek a father in God?
In where?
In God, or in a God,
Oh.
even if not necessarily, because I mean, you talked in the book about how some people are Jewish, some Protestant, some Catholic. So even if not necessarily a specific religion or specific theistic belief system, why does it cause them to reject God in that way rather than to
They reject
seek
God as
God?
good and powerful and loving because they've never experienced that. So they seek an alternative father. And they can either get one of two kinds of fathers, alternatives. You can get a good father. And there are a number of people, for example, who got good fathers. I'm thinking now of the Judge Clarence Thomas in the U.S. He had a dysfunctional father, but he had a very kind, loving, and demanding grandfather. And his grandfather didn't take it, demanded that he be work hard, show the natural intelligence which he had, and develop. And so he mentions that his grandfather really was his real father. And so that was a good substitute father. But what if the substitute father was the local gang leader who was famous for running drugs, which is how they made their money. Most gangs do.
I understand.
So then you have a substitute father who you admire and respect and show off to and try to be like him. And he demands that you start running drugs and selling them and all the rest. So you pick a bad substitute. And unfortunately, bad substitutes are more likely available in many cases.
I understand. I think what I'm understanding from what you're saying essentially is that a father helps you see what God could be like. And so if the only examples of a father you've had are weak, abusive, or absent, you naturally cannot conceive of a present, loving, strong father. And
Right.
I suppose if just any one of those things is present, if a father who is a proxy for God the Father or God is weak or absent or abusive, just any one of those features is terrifying by itself. A weak father cannot protect you from the dangers of the world. An absent father
Right.
doesn't love you, and that tells you that I guess that really crushes your self-worth. And an abusive father is horribly scary because of the damage they cause.
Worst of all, yes. So that's how it's set up psychologically, and that's what we've understand now. It's part of the failure of the attachment bond to develop. As I said, we have an attachment bond with the mother, but mothers are on average much better at being good mothers than fathers are at being good fathers. And so the result is you will function as a human being if you have a good mother. You'll be emotionally integrated and interpersonally capable. but you won't have the ability to deal positively with the outside world where your father would have been the model.
I see.
The father is the model of the outside world. He's the model of what it's like out there. And if he's not there, then you sort of hate it. You're an implicit revolutionary because the outside world is implicitly doesn't like you because it's never supported you and you never had a father to introduce you to it and make it clear to you that it's important and positive.
Yeah. I remember reading when Hitler spoke about his parents, he said, I respected my father, but I loved my mother.
Yeah. Well, I don't think he even respected his father because he didn't go to his father's funeral.
Yeah. And I remember he was very, very vehemently against being a civil servant, just like his father was before. And,
Yeah.
I think the world would have been a much better place if he'd,
He'd been a civil servant.
if he went down a
Yeah.
different path. So something else, I'm really interested to talk about how your own faith has developed as well, because you talked quite a lot about your understanding the basis for your own atheism at the time, which you described as superficial atheism. Just before that, I'd like to know, from your perspective, does the effect of, what are the differences between the effect of fatherlessness on girls compared to boys? And
Oh,
shaping
yeah,
their
that's
faith?
yeah. Well, in general, women are less likely to be atheists on average. And even those who reject, like many feminists, reject God the Father, they often have a substitute god or goddess as a replacement. So they're not technically atheists. They believe perhaps in, in Juno or the Great Witch or some woman who's representing divinity, or they pick spirituality or something like that. The reason is women in general are much more involved in relationships and they are far more important to them. And the absence of any relationship with God leads them to find a relationship with a substitute form of deity. Not always, but that's a tendency on average for women who reject God, particularly many feminists. There are traditional women, or women who are atheists in the traditional sense, usually because their parents were, and were taught them to be atheists, and they followed up in it in a scientific community which supported it. But the main thing is women are more apt to look for a new kind of relationship. Ayn Rand did in her Ideal Man, in all of her novels. Many others did as well, looked for some sort of feminine substitute. But that's not always the case. So I'd say women are less likely to be atheists. If they are, they may just be a different kind of theism or a different kind of believing in some kind of spiritual deity. But in some cases, too, are just about like the male atheist.
And I think also, you see more of a disdain, not just for God the Father, but for men in general, I think. Would you agree with that observation?
Yes. That in fact, one of the reasons they don't want to like God the Father is they don't like men. And one of the various reasons they don't like men, the most common one is that men have treated them badly.
Yeah.
I mean, they've abused them physically or sexually or whatever. So why would you like somebody, or why would you like that sex that had done that to you? And this is especially true with women who are not particularly good looking or attractive. They get used sexually and abused, and they don't have any feminine charm. So they have to move away from the feminine role in relationship to men, and they often become very sad and angry feminist types, if you will, anti-men.
Yeah. Wow.
But it's a tragedy often caused by men themselves.
Yeah, and I think that, that leads me on to something else I wanted to explore. With all of what we've been talking about, of course, there's been a rise in the number of people that identify as atheists, a significant increase historically. And I know in your book you talk about several other factors that can influence that, like the time in history, for example, as society changes, various things which can influence that. But do you think we're currently going through a fatherhood crisis or fatherless crisis?
I think we're going through a crisis, and I think we're beginning in psychology and other places to see that the answer is for men to be better fathers. And what we have to do is men have to understand that being a father is the highest form of manhood. It's not being rich. It's not being powerful. It's not. Those aren't the highest forms. There are good forms. There can be if you put your money and your power in the service of other people. But the highest form of manhood is fatherhood, and that means loving sacrifice for those around you. And the only place where we admire men for sacrifice is in the army, where if you fall on the grenade and it saves your buddies' lives, you're dead and given the Medal of Honor. But you may have to sacrifice for your family. There'll be no Medal of Honor, but that's in fact what a father should do. And one of the reasons for that is if you look around and look at your wife or at the mother sacrifices a lot for her children. She shows her love through sacrifice. But that's the highest form of womanhood, is being a good sacrificial mother, either with your natural children normally or sometimes with other people's children.
Yeah, and I would say for the father who has his heart set on Christ, his reward, his treasure will be in heaven. So even though there might not be the recognition socially, we know that our heavenly Father sees. And you've seen Jesus, you've seen the Father. Amen. Amen. I mean,
sacrificial love.
What I found really refreshing and quite encouraging to hear from you is that psychology seems to be embracing this, because for a long time I felt frustrated growing up, and I didn't know why, but when I came to realize why, it seems like everywhere you go, everyone and all the smart people and all the geniuses are trying to completely remove any distinction between men and women. I remember a church that I used to attend, and I have particular views about men in leadership. I think men are called to spiritual authority in churches. I think that's biblically consistent. And I used to struggle when I go to a lot of churches that would be egalitarian. They'd have men and women in leadership and everything else. And I remember at one point I said to myself, I don't want to learn how to be a person of God. I want to learn how to be a man of God. I want to learn how to be uniquely a man of God.
God made us as male and female.
Mm-hmm. But it seems as though in so many places, and especially in psychology, the idea that men and women are innately different and bring innately different strengths.
That was an ideological issue. And it is an ideology that has already topped and is beginning to fade as more and more evidence is coming out. And you look at all the biological evidence for male and female differences, it's foundational. It goes on, almost every organ of the body is different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really...
not just the brain, but the heart, the kidneys, liver, everything's different. And often in important ways. For example, women their heart is quite different from men's. And they get as a result, they get different kinds of heart attacks. Dealing with the surgery on a woman's heart is different. In fact, it's much more difficult because the vessels are much smaller and so forth. So it's very tricky. But we have big differences, and what we're really rediscovering is something different. Not only that we're different, we're rediscovering two new things about this difference. One, that our differences are complementary. That together, men and women make something better than either is by themselves alone. Yes. That there's something complementary about men's strengths and women's strengths. Even men's and women's weaknesses are complementary in a way. Yeah. And so we're learning complementarity, but you can't have complementarity unless there are differences.
Yes. And it's really interesting you highlight that, because one thing that I'm often struck by is, when we look at the creation story and God said, let us make man in our image, and he makes Adam, and then he sees Adam, and then God says, this is the first time in all of creation that God doesn't follow up with his creation with "it is good." In fact, the very first
Yeah.
thing he says is, "It is not good for man to be alone."
That be
And
alone.
I find it
Yes.
striking that it wasn't Adam's idea that he was alone. Like, Adam didn't say to God, "Hey God, thanks for this, but can you make me a companion?" Adam had no need of his lack, but it was God who said it's not good that man should be alone, because God knew how to best form mankind in a way that would thrive. And so then
Would be
God,
best.
with his wisdom, in his sovereignty, creates Eve and brings them together. And that's when Adam's like, ah, okay, yes, bone of my bone,
The
flesh of
bone
my
of my
flesh.
bone, blood of my blood. And by the way, the word rib is not accurate.
Okay.
The Hebrew word was not that Eve was made out of Adam's rib. The Hebrew word that was used is the word that was used for one half of a body of an animal that was being sacrificed and burnt.
Wow.
So it was half, it was half of him.
Wow.
It's the same thing, the same word used for half of an animal when it has been cut in half to be burned as a sacrifice.
Wow. That's incredible. So, Dr. Paul, at this point,
So,
oh,
so she is your other half,
hmm
and very likely your better half too.
yeah. And you know what? I think if we see them that way and recognize, I mean, my wife and I, we talk about this all the time, that our marriage significantly improved when we started celebrating each other's differences, not condemning them. You know, why
Yeah,
don't you think the way I think? Well, you're not meant to.
right.
You know.
Yeah, but together, those two ways of thinking better image God.
Amen. Amen. And that's the key thing about bearing the image of God. So, Dr. Paul,
And I
you.
wanted to say
Oh, please.
one other thing on this.
Hmm.
Not only is complementarity something that's now beginning to be discovered, but the word for when complementary works is called synergy.
Yes. Yeah.
And synergy is something greater than anything by either sex by itself. The simplest example is no sex can create a child by itself. Put the two together, and the synergy creates a new child, a
Hmm.
new person. But in many other ways, we create a new synergy when we put a man and a woman together. And it's just like when you have a man separately, you have 10 units of goodness. A woman separately, you have 10 units of goodness. You put them together and you have 10 times 10.
Yeah.
You have 100 units of goodness, and that's the synergy.
Yeah. Amen. And I think rediscovering that will have, I mean, manifold benefits that we could not even comprehend. And I think this
Yes, and
speaks
I
to the
think
wisdom
we're
of God.
starting to rediscover it. I think the crisis has been, we're slightly over the crisis and just beginning to again move toward the solution.
Amen.
And let me put in a word here now. I wrote a book that came out about 2 years or 3 years ago called The Complementarity of Women and Men. So you might want to find some answers there. I edited the book, and there are three women who have authors who wrote chapters and two men.
Fantastic. I think definitely for our next conversation, I'll be diving into that one and hopefully unpacking some things there as well. So, Dr. Paul, your own journey from atheism to theism is also quite interesting. Tell me a bit. I mean, I know you talked in the book about realizing the superficial psychological basis for your own atheism. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, there's something new since the book about me. I had a modest degree of hostility to my father. I found him terribly irritating, and we would never agree about anything, at least when I was in my 20s, let's say when I went to college and into graduate school. And tell you a funny story. I was there with my wife and visiting my family, and my father was quite elderly. He was born in 1883. So at the time he was in his 90, at least was 90 when this was happening. Anyway, my wife and my mother were in the kitchen working on food preparation. I was out in the living room with my father, arguing with him and carrying on. And my mother turned to my wife and said, outside there are two professors and no students, which was telling you that we were both arguing and talking to each other in a hostile way or in a way that was closed to the other. So I had a moderate case of dysfunctional father, but I got over it as time went on. But I wasn't quite even aware of that when I wrote the book.
And so would you say, I mean, I know in the book you talked about being in academia and wanting to, I suppose, blend in with a mostly atheistic culture at the time, and it was
Oh yes,
socially
yeah, that
acceptable.
that that I did. Yes.
But you would say that actually, even with that as well, was the baggage from a bad relationship with your father. So how did all of that play together, looking back
How
at
did
it?
I get out of that?
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, actually, the wake-up call for me was knowing I was going to be a father. I got married. My wife and I were both atheists, and we made up our own vows. No mention of God in our wedding vows. We got a minister to come and marry us, a liberal minister who didn't seem to mind. God, I'm sure, came anyway. We got married. The first year we were, both atheists. My wife was a young professor in the French department. So in that summer we went to France, but she was a French medievalist. So we spent a lot of time in France, strangely enough, in some of the beautiful French cathedrals. Funny place for two atheists, but they were very beautiful and we liked them, and something was sort of bubbling underneath about the beauty of God and so forth. Came back that fall, and then my wife became pregnant, and a year later, or 9 months later, we had a baby girl named Rebecca. And all of a sudden, I was a father. And that's what made me, getting married was a big change, but becoming a father was even more so. Suddenly I had a whole new role. And the question was, what do I stand for? Who am I? That was the challenge. And I began looking around. This was about 1971, all right? And the world was filled with skepticism, rejection of faith, and so forth. And particularly in the academic world, particularly I was at New York University in the middle of Manhattan, New York City. Wasn't exactly a highly religious environment, to put it mildly. But I looked around and I said, what can I believe in? What could I stand for? And I found there were only 4 things that seemed possible. One, I could go into leftist politics, that kind of thing, as a worldview. But I already had a lot of friends who were in there. I knew the future head of the Communist Party in America. A woman, actually, a young woman, who was very much of a communist and so forth. And I knew her, but I wasn't very impressed with her as a person. I knew some others like that, so I wasn't impressed with them. I figured I could go in another way. I could go into the new spirituality, the vague kind of New Age spirituality. I'd been out at Stanford in California, and it was happening out there all over the place in the late 60s, well, even in the early 60s out there. I won't go into all that. I was somewhat involved in it, saw it uphand. The New Age spirituality was also relatively linked from the beginning with drug experiences, hallucinogens. And I wasn't impressed with that. It just seemed like, you could pick whatever kind of spirituality you want and move around. It had no stability in the life of an individual even. The third possibility was to remain as, a good skeptical atheist and worship myself. That is, I'm all there is. This life is all there is. I believe in evolution. There's a materialist world. When I die, that's the end. Well, I knew enough by that time that to put myself at the highest level wasn't going to make any sense. I knew that to worship myself I was worshiping a kind of fool in some sense. It was a projection of an idealized person that I actually wasn't. So the only other possibility was traditional religion. So that was Christianity. And I looked around, and every now and then, even in the New York Times, you'd see something published. Something said by Billy Graham, something said by the Pope, something said by another religious figure. And I had the strangest feeling when I read these things. I knew what they were saying was true, but I couldn't believe it. That's right, but I can't believe that. That's a whole other world, that's... And I had this stereotyped understanding of these people all being sort of silly Bible thumpers or something like that. But as time went on, I said, well, at least I should explore it. And I went to one or two liberal Protestant churches, and I could see they were already biting into modern progressive notions. And I knew what I was leaving. I was leaving secular humanistic progressivism with the human being as the implicit God of it all. What you want is what God wants. Everyone's a deity. But then I found a very conservative Anglo-Catholic church, an Anglican church that was very conservative. And my wife and I said where at least they preached the gospel from the pulpit without any qualifications. And so that started me. But then after a while, I won't go into it, the fact that I saw what was going to happen to the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Church was very clear. And it has happened since this. This was in the middle 70s now. I won't go into all of that. And a friend had just become a Catholic, so we moved to the Catholic Church. One thing I never had any contact with, which would have made it a different story perhaps, I had no contact with good, intelligent, enthusiastic evangelicals. They weren't around. But since then, I've met a lot of them, people like you, and they're wonderful. And so I like to work with them, and I have a lot of good friends, and they've helped me, and I've helped them.
How would you say we ought to think about redeeming the fatherless? I mean, I know you're talking at the end of the book about approaching atheists with compassion, understanding the kind of things that might predispose them towards atheism. Can you talk about how you might recommend we think about that? Or should we just consider, atheists who grew up with terrible fathers, weak, abusive, absent fathers as, a lost cause and focus on the next generation?
Look, we're supposed to be loving to everyone, including our enemies. And I'll mention an example of this. Christopher Hitchens, among his best friends were 3 or 4 evangelical Protestants. And they stayed with him the whole time, even the one when Hitchens was up there yelling about God's non-existence and all of that. They were his friends, and they stayed with him the whole time. And when Hitchens got cancer, they did the best to get the top cancer doctors to him and everything. There was no evidence that Hitchens converted on his deathbed, but they reached out to him as loving friends, even though he was an intellectual enemy from his atheism. And that's how we have to be. We have to love our enemies. And so you have to love those atheists because, in fact, God says something about atheists implicitly. He says he wants people not to be lukewarm. You have to be hot or cold. Well, if you're hot, let's say you're a believer. If you're cold, you're maybe an atheist. But he wants you to be hot or cold, but not lukewarm. And that's because the cold can sometimes convert, like St. Paul. Yeah. So as far as I'm concerned, atheists are alive to the issue. Pray for them, befriend them, and then leave it in God's hands.
Yeah, I've always understood that passage around being lukewarm, hot or cold, slightly differently. So I mean, we know that God. I mean, the scriptures talk about God wanting all men to come to, or all men to be saved, and there's obviously debate around that. And I've often thought about the Laodiceans who Jesus was talking to and correcting them about their lukewarmness, knowing that they had around those cities, they had 2 water sources, one coming from, I think, the north, one coming from the south. And so the ones coming from the north that was started off hot, by the time it reached them would be lukewarm, and the ones coming from the other side, by the time it reached them, should have been cold, but instead it was lukewarm. And the reason that the water was lukewarm is because it was far from the source, and that we should remain with the source that is Jesus. But just one more thing that I wanted to end on. What would you say from your, both, I guess, studies, but also own practical experiences being a father, what would you say, what are some best practices to be a good representation of God the Father to a child?
I would suggest two things, or three things. One, show love and respect to your wife, their mother. And then show the same to your children. Let them know you love them. Say it. Hug them. Spend time with them. Let love not be some secret that you have somewhere. Of course I love you. No, you have to show it. Love is basically a form of action. It's a virtue, but virtues are in fact performances. They're not just ideas. A virtue that's just an idea is never significant. It has to be performed. You have to show courage. You have to show justice. You have to show love. You have to show self-control. It's a performance. So you have to show your love and show that to your children. And the third thing I would say, after you've shown that to your wife and then to your children, is to show your children how to do something and live in the outside world. I don't know, take them fishing, take them hunting, take them to the office, show them how to play chess, football games. Make them understand that in the outside world, you're at home and they can be at home with you. That the outside world is some place that they're going to be in a lot of their life. And for particularly the boys, they're going to have to learn how to cope and function in that world. And their dad showed them how, or at least made it clear that you could do it. He didn't show them the way that they would do it. They may be an athlete and their father was a professor, or the other way around. But that you could be out in that world and function well and have friends and respect, you show that to your children, and including your daughters. There's a lot of evidence that daughters with good fathers are especially successful.
That's, I think, as you were sharing that, I'm reminded of the passage, where Paul talks about fathers bringing up their children, not provoking them to anger, but bringing them up in the instruction and discipline of the Lord. And that discipline, that instruction, yes, it has to be taught. So there has to be catechism, teaching them the scriptures, teaching them about the Bible, but there also has to be caught. They have to see it. They have to feel it. They have to sense that from their fathers. And I find it interesting as well, just a thought that came to me. You talk in the book about weak, abusive, or absent fathers. And when I think about what the number one objection that many atheists bring up towards theism, they'll say, how can God be all loving, all knowing, omnipresent, and all powerful? And it's almost like an inversion of the three. The idea that a God can't be strong and love me and be all knowing or near or present, because that's something they haven't experienced. And if we are going to represent God the Father well, then we'd want to demonstrate that we are strong fathers that love our children and know them intimately
and are wise. Yeah, you must be loving, wise, and strong.
Yes.
Now, if you want to know how to experience that, well, you have to try. But I want to mention something that's relevant here. Now there have been recorded around the world thousands of things that are called near-death experiences. And overwhelmingly in those experiences, people meet a source of all-powerful love that shows itself in many ways to them. And many of them meet Jesus. Not all meet Jesus. Others will meet just an angel that they may meet Jesus later, If they've in a near-death experience, they're not in heaven very long. They come back, or they're not in the other world very long. They come back. They had many other things I'm sure to go to yet. So what they see is just a picture, a part of heaven. But many come back, and what Jesus communicates to them is overwhelming love and strength and authority, but overwhelming love and support and knowledge, knowing everything about you. So there it is. And near-death experiences are extraordinarily difficult for atheists to cope with, because over and over they show that there's a world after death. Whatever they say, they all say that world is more real. And many an atheist, after a near-death experience, comes back a believer. Nobody comes back an atheist who was once a believer. They may come back a little scared about hell, but they don't come back and not believing.
Yeah, yeah. And again,
But if you look into the near-death experiences, you'll see over and over again how it's perfectly clear there is that death is a transition, not an ending.
yeah. And just like you said earlier, when there's so many correlations, you then have to question causation.
Right.
Yeah.
And because they all say, everyone says, my experiences there were more real than I have experience here.
Dr. Paul, thank you so much for this conversation. We definitely have to do it again. And I'm going to, like you said, I'm going to read that book around complementarity, and I'm sure I'll have a lot more questions for you. But thank you so much for your time.
Okay. Adios.